Good afternoon, and hope everybody's geared up for a nice holiday Memorial weekend coming up here. We have a big week ahead of us. So right after we get through with a nice little break and a 3-day kind of hiatus from the crazy markets, we are going to be thrown in the mix of things. And actually, it starts with tomorrow, really. So we're going to spend some time talking about that and kind of a question of the week about what this data kind of means, why we're seeing maybe a little bit of a pullback from these, this rev limiter that we keep hitting, and really what the market seems to be watching ahead. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, data, trends that we're watching, hopefully weed out a bit of the noise along the way as well. So really excited to get into things today because although it's not going to be a lot of what has happened, it's going to be a lot of what is coming. So we have a lot to cover. Keep in mind as we kind of get into this that Monday is Memorial Day, so we're heading into Memorial weekend. Markets will be closed on Monday, so just kind of be prepared. But I think it will be a nice breath after some data that we get tomorrow and before we get into a heavy week of things here next week. So let's talk a little about what's happened, and then we'll talk about what's coming. So maybe a couple data points to touch on, or not data points, really, news stories to touch on over the last week is last Friday, we had Fed Chair Powell on a panel, and then just yesterday, we had the Fed minutes released as well. So a lot of Fed talk, and actually, this is what is so relevant going into next week as well. The panel with the Fed Chair Powell on last Friday, maybe the biggest takeaway was that it was still a little unclear as to whether or not there is a need to raise rates. I think that was some of the direct statements made, is that it is still unclear if we need to raise rates further, but the tone seemed to hint more towards a pause, I would say, which seems to line up, well with what general media has been sharing from the past Fed meeting. However, we fast forward to just yesterday on Wednesday, and Fed minutes were released and suggested that really Fed officials are almost divided, almost exactly divided. Now, when Fed Chair Powell is sharing maybe more of a hint of a pause, maybe that adds like a little more weight on that side of the camp. But from the minutes on Wednesday, really, we saw a lot of Fed officials divided on whether we pause rates or continue hiking. The June meeting is coming up, so June 12th, 13th, and that's a big one. Now, unfortunately, what I think this has led to is maybe even more confusion about what's ahead. But what I do want to touch on briefly is that the Fed minutes also suggested that there's a little uncertainty. They're concerned about some uncertainty and economic impacts of these continued hikes, and especially with some of the banking challenges that we saw recently, how that relates to possibly recession and some slowdown here ahead, not because of more banks failing, but more because of some tightened lending and all the challenges that come along with that. But I think that this is going to be the next week is going to really start to tell that story, because at the end of the day, those are both as kind of gray as it can get, and last meeting was as well. Now, as I share what comes up next week, remember that the Fed, although they're not supposed to, I think has been very clear they do not like to disturb markets. And so we'll kind of take this, look through that lens as we share what's coming up next week. Coming up is really important, and our question of the week is really going to be about how this all relates to markets. But next week we have PCE data tomorrow. So tomorrow is a big day, and of course heading into a 3-day weekend as well. So markets could react, but also maybe take a little bit of a pause, because coming right up the following week we have the start of jobs week. The Fed cares about inflation and they care about jobs. So we are heading right into the throes of things. And again, although PCE data, inflation data, is going to be the biggest one tomorrow, maybe the markets take a little bit of pause heading into the week to see what comes out of jobs, but we can probably expect some movement tomorrow based on the number that comes out. So the question of the week this week is basically is talking about the market's reaction lately. The market has basically flatlined, and over the last couple of days, it's pulled back a little bit. Nothing dramatic, but it has pulled back a little bit. And what I will share is, for those who do listen to us pretty regularly, we've been sharing this story for quite some time. The market has been in a trading range for a very long time, not just this year. Go back to, I guess, all the way back to probably April of 2022, and we've basically been in this range. So we've hit this upper rev limiter, and it doesn't mean it has to stop, but it means that there's a little more pressure and a little more challenge to get through before it breaks through. And so we see it pulling back again. Now, what I think is really going on is that the markets are really watching the next, let's say, week or so of data to determine what this next step may look like. And more importantly, watching what the Fed does in the June 13th decision and press conference, right? So we have PCE data, again, inflation, which is one of the bigger ones that the Fed is watching tomorrow. We have jobs all week next week, which is a huge data point that the Fed is watching. If the job market is still strong, they really are just watching inflation, maybe is a good way to think about it. Inflation and the economic slowdown, right? And then we have one more CPI report the day before the Fed makes their decision and shares in their press conference. So although we do get another inflation data point before the June 13th meeting, the reality is that the PCE data point tomorrow, ahead of the long weekend, is probably one of the biggest ones, because it's going to be hard for the Fed to factor in the CPI data, although they'll get some estimates, but hard for them to factor in the CPI data, obviously the day before they share their decision, right? So again, this week is really huge, and of course, right ahead of the long weekend, and then jobs the next week. I think that it's important to note that this may tell the story, right? If we get a surprise data point either to the upside or the downside, that likely is going to tell the story of what's ahead, assuming that there's no further challenges the Fed sees on the economic front. However, if it is basically in line with expectations or nothing really telling a story, what I will share is, although I do believe that the inflation may be higher, and it's very likely, I shouldn't say that, it's more likely than the market is pricing in that the Fed could hike in June. To go on the flip side of that, what I will share is that if this data point is kind of just in the middle, it's going to make me believe that it's more likely the Fed stops. And the reason for that is because although the Fed is not supposed to care about the markets, the reality is that they have in the past, and they've tried to make sure to clearly voice what's coming. And I think that, again, assuming that this data point is not completely out of left field, I think that that's likely what's going to happen. They're going to voice that, it's likely that they stop and do that in order to not upset the markets. But if this number is higher, that's where the risk surprise could be. And that's what we've been watching, because if it is, and the Fed does hike, I don't think that the market is pricing that in at this point. So just something to kind of keep a very close eye on. And again, this week is extremely important. So not to give you too much to watch for here this weekend ahead of the holidays, but certainly it is important, and it is something we'll be watching very closely. So in the meantime, enjoy your holiday Memorial weekend. It's supposed to be beautiful here in the Pacific Northwest, so hopefully you get out in the sun. And we will be back next Thursday to kind of break down what is going on. So definitely stay tuned, and we will be right back next Thursday at 3 to kind of break apart what actually transpired and what may be ahead.